Welcome along to this evening's group coaching call, team. Today's presentation is why your max heart rate isn't a good start point to determine training zones. Now, this is some methodology that first developed in the late 70s or maybe even earlier before that, when the physiological advantages of training and measuring heart rate were sort of first starting to be researched. We didn't know, I say we as the collective, we as a world of athletes and coaches and academics and scientists didn't know about thresholds and lactate heart rates and blood lactate and all that other physiological markers. And so the benchmark was set as the max heart rate because that was the only benchmark they had. But one of the key reasons why it's not a good starting point to determine those training zones is the methodology for it is well and truly outdated. However, it still often gets quoted, despite being outdated, often by people well-meaning. They've read something once in a while, or found something online. And I'll sort of talk about why it's not relevant, and also then look at some of the calculations utilized, and then we'll look at what is relevant and what I utilize for my training of my athletes that are on the call with us, as well as future athletes as well. And I'll also touch on the 220 minus your age formula, and discuss the disadvantages of that as well. So we don't race at our maximum heart rate, and that does not matter. Well, it doesn't matter which event you're doing or what the duration of that event is. We're not trying to race at your max heart rate, and nor do we train specifically as well for max heart rate. You can't actually increase your max heart rate. As you age, it will decrease, but we can't improve it, so to speak, or make it higher, or change it other than it getting a little bit lower as we age. Now, the thought process around the 220 minus your age came from some research that discovered that older people had lower maximum heart rates than younger people. And our maximum heart rate, as sort of touched on, does decrease as we age. And it's roughly about 1 beat per year. Hence the reason that calculation sort of came about. But anyway, racing is done at different intensities. Longer races are done at lower intensities because we can't sustain those higher intensities for that long duration. And shorter races are also the inverse. They're done at a higher intensity. Now, in longer races, it doesn't mean we can't have spurts of higher intensity on a hill or sprinting to try and get ahead of someone or beat someone. Doesn't mean we can't do that. But if we're looking at sustaining a constant effort for a longer duration, then keeping that nice and steady is the optimal way to go. If we look at some really short events like a 50-meter swimming race or a 100-meter sprint, those events aren't actually long enough for you to achieve your maximum heart rate. Your heart rate will increase, but with the short duration of it, it won't actually get to your maximum. Now, at some point, if we just went as absolutely hard as we could, we would get to a peak, but we wouldn't be able to sustain that. So as soon as we got to that peak, that would start dropping off, so to speak. So what is your maximum heart rate? Now, a true reflection of it is the maximum heart rate that you can sustain for any given discipline. Running is typically higher than cycling, which is about 10 beats per minute lower, and then swimming and kayaking tend to be lower still. And that reason, or the reason for that, is different muscle groups are utilized with a larger or lesser amount of muscle mass being utilized to conduct that activity. So running, we're actually trying to push off the ground with each and every stride, gaining flight. And because of that, we are typically, there's going to be more energy required to be utilized. Therefore, we need more oxygen pumped to the muscles that are working. Running uses some of the big muscles, hamstrings, calves, quads are involved, glutes are involved. Similar sort of muscles to cycling, although they're used in a different sequence. Cycling typically has the quads and the glutes with support from the hamstrings and the calves and also the lower back. But we're not trying to gain flight with every single pedal rotation. And so it doesn't require as much oxygen delivered to those muscles. When we look at swimming, we're lying prone or horizontal in the water, and our legs, where our big muscles are, is providing minimal input. Only about 15 to 30% of propulsion is from the legs. So we don't have that high oxygen demand that cycling or even higher running has as a result of that. Similar with kayaking, you're staying seated that whole time. Yes, there's a little bit of muscle activation involved in sitting and staying in that upright position in the kayak, but it's pretty minimal. So that's why those the maximum heart rate for the different disciplines are different from each other. Now, how do you actually get your maximum heart rate? Well, we can easily calculate it, which I think I alluded to earlier, is totally wrong. The 220 minus your age is one of the more popular formulas to calculate your max heart rate. Another popular formula is taking your age and multiplying that by 0.7 and then subtracting that from 208. It starts getting confusing. Those methods don't take into account anything other than your age. They don't take into account your discipline or sport, and they don't factor in anything else. In fact, your maximum heart rate is pretty much determined by genetics, and those calculations are wrong for 80% of people, only right for about 20% of the population. The other 80% of us can vary either above or below the calculated maximum by up to 25 beats. So, for example, if someone was 50, their theoretical maximum, or actually, let's go 45 because the maths is easy because I've got it for one of the calculations in front of me. But we'd be looking at a theoretical maximum heart rate of 175 under one calculation and 176.5 beats per minute using the other one. When in fact, someone who is 45 could have a true maximum heart rate anywhere between 150 and 200 beats per minute. So it's a long way out for those people that are on the outlying edges of that. And any calculation for training zones from that is not even going to be close. Take, for example, the person that's got a genuine maximum heart rate of 150 beats per minute, and they're trying to attain, let's say, 90% of that, they will be maxing out sort of 135, or they'll be in that zone from 135 and above. But the theoretical calculation, they need to be getting above their maximum, their actual maximum heart rate. So they're not going to be achieving their time in zone if we use that. So how do we measure our maximum heart rate? The simplest and easiest way is if you're a runner, go have a good warm-up, find a good long hill that's going to take at least 10 minutes to run up, and start running up it at a reasonably solid effort. For the last couple of minutes, pick up that pace. And then for the final 30 seconds, absolutely sprint, giving it everything you've got for those final 30 seconds. And then as you're trying to avoid vomiting and gasping for air and sucking in oxygen, have a look at your heart rate monitor and see what the biggest number it shows on the screen is. If you're a cyclist, do the same thing. Find a hill that's going to take at least 10 minutes to climb. Have a really good warm-up. Go climb that hill. Repeat that process and have a look and see what the biggest number you can find is. Swimming and kayaking, slightly different story. I will brush over those as examples because I don't recommend them and it's not too relevant. So what do we do, or why do we not use it? Racing, we pretty much do that at a steady state. The exceptions being cycling, road races, and mountain biking cross country events, and if a running race was really tactical and you're slowing down, speeding up. sort of thing. Now, because training intensities, or because we don't race at the maximum heart rate, and because we do our racing well, we're trying to optimize things by racing at a steady state, any training intensity should also be based from that steady state effort that can be sustained. Now, it's important that it's a maximal steady state effort. If you're going out for 3 hours and just cruise, that's a different story from going out and riding hard or running for that longer duration, the 3 hours at that steady state. Conversely, if we're looking at a short event, maybe a 5K running race, and we just cruise that 5Ks, we could possibly, or we can do a time, but it won't be the best time we're capable of. So we need to look at some sort of steady state effort. Now, threshold is the most popular one, and by virtue of its definition, it's an intensity or an effort that can be sustained for about 60 minutes. And we call that FTP, or functional threshold power for cycling, or FTPR for functional threshold power for runners that use a power meter. If we were to measure blood lactate and went out and rode, ran, kayaked or swam solidly for an hour, and we measured the blood lactate, we'd find it would be about 4 millimolar of lactate. And that's often used as a benchmark for what we can sustain. And so any blood testing looking at lactate levels, that 4 millimolar is the point that's determined as threshold, because that's what you can sustain for 60 minutes, or the majority of people can. Similarly, if we looked at what heart rate was sustained for that duration, then that would be classified as threshold heart rate. Now, that's when we use 1 hour as the benchmark. We can use other durations if we wanted. And you might hear of critical power, 6-minute critical power for cyclists, and other such markers. Another one is 2.5 millimolar of blood lactate being the aerobic threshold. So we can use those blood lactate measurements and look at what our heart rates are doing at those points and use them as benchmarks to determine various training zones from if needed. And that all sort of applies regardless of what measure we're using. That sustained effort for those 60 minutes is a good benchmark. And we can have our threshold heart rate, threshold power, threshold pace, threshold lactate, etc. from that. That, in a nutshell, is why I use a threshold-based intensity measure as opposed to maximum heart rate as the start point for any training zones. Any questions? None are springing up, so happy to go around the room and talk about any training or any other related questions. Stu, you're usually quick on the draw, and I think you were probably there first, so you can be first cab off the rank tonight.
So this blood lactate, because I test for my blood glucose.
Yep.
Would you recommend testing for that?
No, no. Blood glucose, blood lactate, totally different things. You'll need a totally different monitor to measure it. It's, I don't want to say a complicated process. It's not too complicated. It's very similar to what you do already, just with a different device. But we're not going to be out there training, doing finger pricks halfway through a velocity class or halfway through a workout. I know there's a lot of Norwegians base their training around that. We can get the similar measures through an FTP test, through a ramp test. We're calculating the same training zones based on some science around that.
Fair enough. I just saw a device online that I thought I might invest in to test the old blood lactate, but that's all right.
Yeah, you can go spend the money if you want, but I've got other things I'd recommend you spend the money on. Jason, your next cab off the rank.
Yeah, just with the various max heart rates and that sort of thing, obviously with them uh differing between disciplines, is there much of an advantage sort of like mine's outrageously high swimming and then probably running, then cycling. Is there much of an advantage to those peaks through the disciplines, or is it just because I'm shitter at different sports?
To use that technical term, your swimming is not as strong as your other disciplines. As a result, you're probably putting in a lot more unnecessary effort that's not involved in your forward propulsion. If you compared yourself to an Olympic level swimmer, you'll see how smooth and graceful through the water they are. Now, having said that, you're not the worst swimmer I've seen, not by a long shot, having swum with you. Um, but on a relative scale with Olympians up here, we've got Jason down here, Ray a little bit above, and other levels of swimmers significantly above both of us. And then we've got Eric the Eels further below us, if anyone's familiar with his backstory. So as a result, you're putting in a lot more effort without getting a lot more go forward from with the enhancement of swimming technique. That will come along nicely for you.
And in a try setting, is that a lot more effort detrimental at the other end of the try, or
Ultimately, we want you coming out of the water as fresh as possible. And then ultimately, we want you getting off the bike as fresh as possible so we can unleash your performance on the run. Well, if we're talking half Ironman distance, then we really want you to get to about the 15K mark so you can have a sharp sort of 5, 6Ks to finish off with. Um, but yeah, the less energy we expend early on in the event, the more we've got for the back end of the event.
cool? Thank you.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
The reason why I gave Stu and Jason the opportunity to have their questions first, they are winner chicken dinners from the Rye the Wilderness Trail event yesterday. I think Stu's trying to show us his winning trophy, which is a beer glass. The team Qwik Kiwi represented well and finished on top of the podium.
Can I just say though, Jason, you ride a gravel bike faster than Coach Ray, and you've only got to run as fast as Jess at Wanaka. That's it.
Oh, fuck.
Anyway, Diane, you were next cab off the rank. You were already in the class in the Zoom call waiting when I logged in. Any
Um,
questions from you?
does a lower heart rate have an impact on that? Because my resting heart rate's quite lowish. Does that have any impact or any advantage, or is it
So,
more of a disadvantage?
no, it's definitely not a disadvantage. So, max heart rate and resting heart rate are totally independent of each other. One doesn't influence the other. Your fitness does influence your resting heart rate. So, the more aerobically fit you are, the lower your resting heart rate will be.
Sweet. That's good.
Sweet. Jess, next cab off the rank.
I was going to say a similar thing because I feel like my resting heart rate's really low, but then when I'm running, I feel like I have a really high heart rate compared to when I look at other people. And then when I'm doing intervals, it doesn't even change that much. Like I feel like I'm always sitting within 10 beats of each other no matter what I'm doing.
Yeah. So once again, your heart rates are totally independent of any other person. Obviously, with your parents, there's going to be a genetic connection with them. But if you try and look at heart rates of yourself versus someone you're racing or someone you're doing a training session with, they are not necessarily going to line up at all. That's because their heart rate, if we look at the max heart rate and know that if the workout called for, say, 90% effort, your max heart rate is going to be totally different from someone else's. And that 90% is going to be at a different, they're both going to be, when they go up, they both go up, when they go down, both will go down, but they're going to be different from each other. So
Yeah.
as for your heart rate, yes, that's one thing I have noticed with yours. Your cruising along heart rate is relatively high. And
Yeah.
also then your racing heart rate doesn't, there's not much room to move in that top end. So there's not much between them.
Yeah. I think I surprised myself the other day on that run that speed when I did, and I hit like 201, and I was like, I hit 201, like that scared me a little bit.
Yep. Don't be scared of that. Like I said, that theoretical maximum heart rate, 220 minus your age, that gives you a even higher number than what you achieved. And that session it wouldn't have been pushing you to your absolute maximum. So there's probably a little bit more wiggle room in there. So don't stress about that.
Yeah. I was also going to ask because I run off power, but when I look at like the pace that I run within the power zones, they're so different to like the same zones and pace zones, and it kind of gets me off. Like the pace that I'm running in the right zone is way quicker than if it was in the zone of my pace one.
Yep.
Does that
So
make
you often run the same route, which is, I'll say, pretty flat, but it's not perfectly flat. So your pace will change on, even if it's only a 1% incline one way, or 1% downhill the other way. So that's throwing your pace zones out by the fact that you're running on a flat, it's not perfectly flat. So sometimes you're running uphill, sometimes you're running downhill. Also, when you go, there's that other run you do, is it on a rail trail?
the rail trail and the gorge?
Yeah. So they're a lot more undulating than your normal run route.
Yeah.
And so they have a bigger influence on it.
Yeah.
So, but once again, we're not measuring apples with apples. We're going, well, these
Yeah.
apples here and these are oranges here in terms of pace and power. Power is determined by effort and is independent of terrain. Pace, yep, it goes up and down with effort, but it's also determined by the terrain and the environmental conditions.
Yeah.
Looks like Stu's got another question, but I'll come back to you, Stu. Let Gareth get a question in first.
Think I've got any questions tonight, so we can just go straight to Stu.
Sweet. All right, back to Stu then.
So obviously in velocity, I'm quite competitive, but my heart rate, I struggle to get that probably more than about 180. And then if you look at yesterday's ride, as soon as I got going, it was 200, 218 was the max. And I struggled for about the first 15 Ks to get it back down to a manageable level of about 162, I think was my average.
Yep.
So is that just an adrenaline-based thing that gets it up there, or is it a psychological thing? Because like I go hard on velocity because I want to win, but obviously there's a disconnect between what I do in the week and what we do in a race.
Yeah, you're an enigma, Stu. I haven't got the answer for you, unfortunately. I have some suspicions. Now, I've talked about my original suspicions, which are different from what they are now, previously offline, in terms of I initially believed that there was some form of interference, possibly from static in your clothing, causing some erroneous high heart rates. But also now I think it's probably more to do with some of your past medical conditions that we won't necessarily go into in this group setting. The exact answer I don't have for you, unfortunately. But yes, there are some very high numbers you generate out on the road, out on the trail. Any other questions pop up?
Just wondering, obviously, while we're all out there looking at our heart data, what red flags should we be looking at? What am I going to see on my wrist that it means I should immediately terminate this workout?
118.
Yep, 218 when you're cruising along. If you're putting in a lot of effort and you see your heart rate go up, don't be alarmed. Used to be back in the good old days, if you went near any high voltage power lines, your heart rate would automatically display 250. And back in the 90s, it was only polar heart rate monitors on the market. And then I think it was called Cardio Sport or something else came along. Both polar and Cardio Sport would just show you 250 near those high voltage lines. These days, there's a lot more. Gareth can probably correct me on the technical term, but there's communication protocols that mean that they're not receiving that interference. So the data is a lot more reliable coming through. High numbers, if you're cruising along and it feels like your heart is going absolutely crazy without putting in any effort. If you're putting in a lot of effort and it's starting to become uncomfortable, back off. And if you're really concerned, go see your doctor.
Can I add a real world example into that?
Yeah, go for it, Stu, because you've got an interesting story about this one. So I'll let you go for it. Just be aware that this is being recorded for on the YouTube and on my website. So
No, it's cool.
only say what you're prepared to say in public.
Absolutely. So, for anyone that doesn't know, I've had a heart condition. I've had a couple of heart attacks. So, I had an incident in 2018 where I was climbing a local hill here and my heart rate went to 227. I previously had a heart attack to that. So, I thought I'd just back off, got down, went up over another hill, said to my partner at the time, we need to get home and we'll just go easy. And by easy on a road bike, I mean about 23 k an hour, which is not fast on a road bike on a slight downhill. You'll know if you're having a medical event. So in that instance, my heart rate was sitting at around about 215 to 220. And as we went from, say, 23 k an hour to 23.5, it would climb to about 227. When I finally decided that things were bad and I called an ambulance, it was 15 minutes before the ambulance got there and my heart rate only came down to 187 within that 15-minute period. So in that time, I didn't have what I would deem to be heart attack symptoms as far as, tight chest or anything like that. But you'll know it's like a tacho in a car. As you accelerate, your heart rate will just take off. But as your acceleration comes back, your heart rate will stay there. And if that's the case, stop and phone an ambulance.
Thanks for sharing that, Stu. Any other questions popped up as a result of that? All right. Thanks for your time this evening, team. Look forward to having a great week of training and everything else that you do next week. And we'll look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks' time for the next group coaching call. All the best. Have a fantastic week, team.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ray.
Cheers, Ray.
Thank you. See ya.
You're welcome, team.